Hello, and welcome to the screencast for contemporary moral issues. This is our unit on the morality of abortion, and this is part 3, which I'm going to split up into part A and part B because it might run a little long. These are the final 3 articles in section 7, and the first one is called Why Abortion is Immoral by Dan Marquis or Marquis. I don't know how his name is pronounced. And that is on page 292 in our textbook. The second article will be A Kantian Argument Against Abortion by Harry J. Gensler, and that begins on page 297. While the very last article in this unit is Virtue Theory and Abortion by Rosalind Hursthouse, and that begins on page 304. That one might be in part B. Okay, so again, this is on page 292 if you want to follow along. And the first thing that Marquis asks us, which might seem incredibly obvious, is why is killing wrong? It might seem like it's so obvious that we don't even have to investigate it further. It's just common sense. It's one of the most universally morally reviled things, killing someone else. But if we want to defend anything, but especially here, the right to life for any entity, and that can include a full-blown adult, a fetus, an animal, we need justification and evidence. We still need a strong argument, even when the conclusion seems absolutely obvious to us. We want to know why something is morally wrong to see which kinds of conclusions we want to come to about which sort of moral scheme that we might be most compelled to follow. And Marquis says, of course, that this wrongness of killing is also central to the abortion debate. On page 293, he gives a couple of reasons that you might come up with to justify your belief in the wrongness of killing. He says maybe it could be that it brutalizes the one who kills. So the person who is a killer becomes desensitized. They become more violent. They become less like someone who you would want in a community. It could also be this wrongness of killing because there's a great loss that the people who know the person who's been killed will suffer when they lose that person. So your family, your friends, everybody in your community will suffer the loss and mourn. He rejects these two ideas because they do happen, of course, but they don't provide any evidence relevantly for the actual wrongness of killing the victim. So it must be the effect on the victim. We still have to go a little bit further and say, what is that effect? Excuse me. And why is that effect so important that it makes killing wrong in almost all cases? And again, on page 293, he says that the effect of the killing on the victim is one of the greatest losses one can suffer, and it deprives one of all the experiences, activities, projects, and enjoyments that would have otherwise constituted one's future. So instead of killing being about rights, like the right to life, at least directly, it's about this loss, this deprivation of a potential future life, which I have abbreviated here because it's the central concept that Marquis is developing in his argument. This is saying that in the future, you are going to have this rich kind of inner life and experience, and this is what's valuable. So when you're killed, this rich future life, this rich potential future life is taken away. And I have these two word clouds here at the bottom because one objection I often get from students is that there are many people who don't live that great of a life, whom a lot of their future, a lot of their experience is going to be more on the left than it is on the right. suffering, stress, loneliness, depression, violence, etc. And Marquis is actually neutral on the type of experiences you might have in this potential future life. It's more about the form of this potential future life, how you have hopes and goals and dreams and values, things that you value, even if you end up having more negative experiences than you do positive ones. It's the type or structure of potential future life that you can have, as opposed to whether it ends up being on the balance negative or positive. And of course, fetuses may not have experiences, activities, projects, enjoyments, values, dreams, goals, hopes while they're fetuses, but they do have this potentially in their future. It's a rich kind of human future. And since this is his central justification as to why killing is wrong, you're taking this future away from somebody, of course fetuses have it. So that's the core of the argument. Any entity that has this PFL, it is wrong to kill. And when you're making your arguments as robust and strong as you possibly can, you want to think about whatever you're committed to logically because of your central thesis, conclusion, or argument. So if you say something like, I hate rainy days, you are logically committed to avoid rainy days. Otherwise, you're being contradictory. And one of the core essences of the way we reason and the way we do logic as human beings is that we realize when we contradict ourselves, we probably are wrong about one thing or the other. It doesn't seem like two things that are opposites can be true at the same time. So when you're committed to something, you need to think through what your beliefs say that you also have to believe. So here he makes 5 things explicit that are corollaries, meaning they flow out of his central commitments. So he says first, this can include non-biologically human entities. His idea that killing is wrong because it deprives the victim of this future. What does he mean here? Well, we looked at one definition of biological humanity where it was just DNA. But you can also say that some people argue for the morality of abortion because they say, well, in the first trimester, it's just a clump of cells. They're not human yet. But if you buy into Marquis' argument, it doesn't matter if they're biologically human yet or not. They will have this future, so it is wrong to kill them. Number 2, he's committed to say killing other kinds of biological creatures can be wrong if they have the PFL. So this might encompass many different animals that we don't right now think of as falling underneath the moral umbrella. Third, he can say euthanasia is permitted with this argument, because oftentimes people who argue for the right to end their own lives are at the end of their lifespan. They're suffering with some kind of terminal illness, with pain, and they don't have the PFL, so euthanasia would be morally permitted. And he realizes that some other arguments about the morality of abortion have a hard time grappling with the wrongness of infanticide, which seems obviously wrong to us just as easily as killing seems wrong to us, just as obviously, just as commonsensically. But when we thought about the author who wrote about personhood, she had a much harder time incorporating the wrongness of infanticide into her theories. And just as the fetus has the PFL, so does the infant. So killing the infant is wrong. 5, he says his thesis does not commit us to believing that all quote-unquote potential persons have the PFL. So let's look at what he means on page 295. This is the second paragraph. He says, this argument doesn't rely on the invalid inference that since it's wrong to kill persons, it's wrong to kill potential persons also. The category is morally central to this analysis is the category of having a valuable future. It's not the category of personhood. So we don't have to worry about what it means to be a person. We only have to think about what potential future this entity has. And if it's rich, if it's layered, if there's an internal mental experience, then they count as belonging to the moral community. Okay, so then Marquis compares his theory to another common theory that he hasn't mentioned yet, that killing and violence is wrong because it creates, on balance, more suffering in the world than it does utility. His argument, I think, is still a kind of consequentialist theory because what makes killing wrong is the consequences of the action of killing, but it's a different set of consequences that it focuses on. It focuses on the loss of the rich future instead of suffering. But he does think that if you think the suffering argument has any merit, if it's compelling to you at all, you have to accept his argument as well, because they have similar premises or pieces of evidence. And he doesn't rule out completely that abortion might be morally acceptable in some very limited set of circumstances. But he concludes that abortion is prima facie morally wrong. On the face of it, in most cases, because you're depriving the entity of this rich, valuable future, the PFL, abortion is usually wrong. Okay, so now we'll move on to the second of 3 articles. This is Harry J. Gensler, and it begins on page 297. And he has what he calls a Kantian argument against abortion. So, of course, we need to think about what it means to have a Kantian moral system backing you up. And I'll give you this reminder. There are 2 ways in which Kant formulated his ultimate rule of moral behavior. We looked mostly at number 1, the mere means formulation. Never use another person as mere means to your own personal ends, but only as ends in themselves. So remember, means and ends are your goals and the way that you get there. So means are the method you use to reach your ends, your goals. And you can use objects, but you should never use people. They should always have all the information that you do so they can make their own reasoned out decision. The second way that Kant formulated his ultimate rule, and he thought it was the same rule just verbalized in a different manner, was the universalizability, that is a mouthful, principle, where he says an act is only morally acceptable if you can consistently imagine that every other agent or person would act in the same way if they were put into relevantly similar circumstances to you. So we come back to that consistency thing, which is, again, the cornerstone of logic and reason. All of our beliefs, to the best of our ability, need to not contradict one another. So one of the places that becomes difficult when we think about any particular activity in this formulation are relevantly similar circumstances. And that is the part of the formulation that Gensler is going to focus on. So one of the common examples is you might think, well, I need some money, I'm going to steal it from my neighbor. But if you think about universalizing that, can you consistently imagine that everyone who needs money can steal from their neighbor? and we could still have a relatively stable society? Probably not. So stealing from your neighbor just because you need some money is not universalizable. So here's the standard argument again. We looked at this briefly when we looked at some of the previous articles. The same thing formulated in a pretty much the same way. Premise 1, the killing of innocent human life is morally wrong. Premise 2, a fetus is an innocent human life. Conclusion from those two premises, therefore abortion is morally wrong. And he doesn't think this works, either for saying abortion is morally acceptable or for saying it is morally unacceptable, because he thinks there are too many ambiguities, too much vagueness in the way that it's worded, and that's reflected in the way people argue about it. A, is killing innocent human life always wrong, or is it normally wrong? So that's important because in normal circumstances, people might say, well, okay, the health of the mother's not threatened, it was consensual sex, etc., etc. B, is a fetus innocent if it is threatening the health or the life of the mother? And C, is there a difference to actively killing and to letting die? So of course, we might remember that that's relevant when the mother's life is threatened. We would let her die as opposed to killing the fetus. He also thinks, separately to these three issues, that there's an unclarity, a vagueness, an ambiguity about what it means to be human. And we've encountered this over and over and over again. Is it genetic? Is it some set of properties? Is it just being born to another human? It's hard. It's very, very difficult to non-arbitrarily pick a point. And he considers 6: conception, individuality, which means you can't split into a twin biologically. The first time we can detect brain waves, or maybe viability. Remember that concept, when the fetus could theoretically survive outside of the mother. When you're born might be the time that you're a human, or maybe when you have something you can call consciousness. So he has those on page 298, and he doesn't think there's any real principled way to pick between the 6. Okay, so before he finally gets into his argument, he considers a utilitarian argument for and against abortion and rejects it out of hand. Recall now that Kantianism only cares about your principles, what's happening inside your head, the reasons why you act. Whereas utilitarianism is the opposite. It only cares about consequences of your actions. It doesn't matter why you're doing what you're doing, as long as the results are more positive than they are negative. You are focusing on the consequential aspects to your action. Now, most of the time I try to recreate the strongest version of the argument that I can find in the article. That's the principle of charity, and it's very important for a critical thinker. We interpret the evidence that the author gives us in the best light possible. We try to see where they're coming from. Because if you aim to develop your critical thinking skills, it's a great technique. Your argument will be stronger because you are considering all possible counters to your own argument, but also your understanding of the issue itself. Because if you want to choose the best supported conclusion that you can, you need to understand every single side of the issue. And I give you this caveat because this author, in my opinion, doesn't do the same for utilitarianism. He instead creates what is called a straw man, which is a much weaker version of your opponent's argument. So you misrepresent your opponent's argument, you attack that misrepresentation, and then because it's easy to attack a misrepresented version, you say, oh, I've defeated that. And it's a fictional opponent, because the only thing he brings up here is rudimentary act utilitarianism. So remember, we thought of many, many flaws in act utilitarianism, because all we care about is that there's more utility or happiness than there is suffering or disutility. So this can lead to all sorts of absurd consequences, where you enslave the minority for the majority's happiness, you kill people to make other people live. But most modern utilitarians, I'd even go so far as to say all modern utilitarians, are not simple act utilitarians. So that is a misrepresentation of the state of utilitarianism. He even uses emotional rhetoric or emotional language when he says that utilitarians have tried to, quote, weasel out of these issues, but have failed. But then he doesn't mention it at all. He doesn't say any sort of way that utilitarians have tried to remedy these bizarre consequences of act utilitarianism. And I think this weakens his eventual conclusion, because he refuses to allow you to think about any consequences as being relevantly similar conditions. So remember, Kant wants us to think about universalizing our motives, but sometimes our motives are about consequences. So we'll see how that affects his eventual argument. Okay. He says, if you agree that abortion should normally be morally permissible, you must agree that if your mother had aborted you as a fetus, you would accept that as morally permissible. Okay, so just think about that for a minute. If your mother had aborted you, you would accept that as morally permissible. Now, he says you have to make sure you're asking the right question, because he doesn't think a fetus has the cognitive capacity to decide this. So it's not you as you were then, it's you reacting to it now with your full cognitive capacities. You also can't say something like, if my will is violated after my death, would I then consent to this action? You can't say that either, because you aren't cognitive when you're dead. You have to be asking something more like this. Do I now consent to the idea of my will being violated after my death? So he's comparing states where you cannot possibly consent to something versus now when you're thinking about the relevant circumstances at a different time. Okay, so you're asking full adult you. If somehow I were a fetus again and my mother decided to abort me, do I consent to that? He says nobody would consent to that, and it's bizarre if you do. I also disagree with that. Okay, so let's illustrate what he thinks is a bizarre inconsistency. This is how he tries to prove to you it's bizarre to consent to your own theoretical abortion. He says, and this is a thought experiment, imagine a mother who could take a drug that would blind her fetus but have no negative health effects on her. She then carries this fetus to term, which is born blind and is blind for the rest of their life. He doesn't think any rational person would agree to this in principle. So why, if we would disallow this blindness drug, would we consent to the mother killing the fetus entirely? If consistency is our central goal, or one of our central goals in reasoning, we have to say that when we universalize it, abortion becomes no longer morally permissible, because it's the same sort of circumstances as poisoning your fetus so they become blind. And that's the central core of his argument. He acknowledges that the fetus, any fetus, has to go through a process of development to become an adult human being. So they might not be the same entity when they're a fetus and when they're an adult. but he sort of glosses over that, in my opinion, because I think you can very consistently say that there are different relevant circumstances to me as a fetus and me as an adult human being. Because when I'm a fetus, I'm dependent upon an adult human being's bodily resources to survive. And when I'm an adult, I do not. And I think those are very relevantly different circumstances to when any mother, or my mother particularly, would choose to terminate or bring a fetus to term. And I don't think he acknowledges that the circumstances are quite different. Let's go back to that, though, because I'm not sure I was 100% clear. I think that there's a difference between a mother who decides to bring a fetus to term and support them or let them live as a developing human being, and one that decides to terminate, because he hinges his case on this thought experiment about how we all react with abhorrence to the idea of someone blinding a fetus they intend to give birth to. And I think those are the relevantly different circumstances. So if we universalized it, we would never think that it was consistent to let all potential mothers blind their children, but we would be able to universalize the idea that abortion may be morally permissible. I'm not even saying that any arguments here touch on whether it is, but I am saying that we can universalize saying that there may be some set of circumstances that allow for a fetus to be terminated, and that those are two very different situations. So I'm going to end there, part 3A, and then look for the very final video, part 3B, about our last article of the morality of abortion. And as always, please ask questions if there's anything you're confused about, or comment if you have anything you'd like to contribute to the discussion. And have a great day.